The sun painted the Montana sky in hues of amber and crimson, as Katherine Ashford clutched her father's letter in her trembling hand. The dusty stagecoach rattled beneath her, each jolt bringing her closer to Silverwood Creek, the frontier town that would either be her salvation or her undoing. It was 1875, and at 23 years old, Katherine had left behind everything she knew in Boston to answer her dying father's final wish, to take over his modest ranch and make peace with the land that had claimed him. Last stop, Silverwood Creek. The driver called out, his voice carrying over the thunder of hooves and creaking wood. Katherine gathered her skirts and stepped down onto the dirt road, her boots sinking slightly into the mud left by yesterday's rain. The town sprawled before her, a collection of wooden structures, saloons with their doors flung wide, and the unmistakable smell of livestock and whiskey hanging in the air. "Miss Ashford," a weathered man with kind eyes approached, removing his hat. "I'm Samuel Porter, your father's attorney." "We've been expecting you." Katherine nodded, attempting a smile despite the exhaustion that weighed on her bones. "Thank you for meeting me, Mr. Porter. I trust my father's affairs are in order," the attorney's expression faltered. "As much as they can be, Miss Ashford. But I'm afraid there's something you should know before we head to the property." They walked toward a modest building with Porter and Associates painted on the window. Inside, Samuel poured her a glass of water and sat behind his desk. "Your father's ranch, the Circle, it's not what you might expect from his letters. The drought hit us hard 2 years ago, and then the cattle fever took most of his stock." Samuel shuffled through some papers. "He managed to hold onto the land, but it's going to take significant investment to make it profitable again." Katherine's heart sank. Her father had always written of his success, of the thriving ranch he'd built. She'd sold everything to come here, believing she would inherit a working operation. "There's more," Samuel continued, his voice gentle. "Your father had an arrangement with the neighboring ranch, the Horizon H. The owner, Quentin Harrington, helped your father through some difficult times. There's an outstanding debt." Katherine straightened her spine. "How much?" $500, a considerable sum. She closed her eyes briefly, calculating the meager funds she had remaining. "I'll speak with Mr. Harrington myself. Surely we can come to an arrangement." Samuel's brow furrowed. "Miss Ashford, I should warn you about Quentin Harrington. He was once the most respected rancher in the territory, but since losing his wife and young son to smallpox 3 years ago, well, he's changed. Folks around here call him the Ghost now. Rarely comes to town, keeps to himself. Your father was one of the few people he still dealt with." Katherine considered this information. A grieving man, a debt, and a failing ranch, not exactly the new beginning she had envisioned. "I'd still like to speak with him," she insisted. "After I've seen my father's property." The Circle Ranch was a half-hour ride from town. Katherine sat beside Samuel in his wagon, taking in the vast landscape, rolling hills dotted with scrub brush, the distant mountains tinged purple in the fading light. When they crested the final hill, she got her first glimpse of her inheritance. The main house was smaller than she'd imagined, a simple 2-story wooden structure with a sagging porch. The barn needed new boards, and the corral fence had collapsed in several places. A handful of cattle grazed in the distance, pitiful remnants of what should have been a thriving herd. "It's not much," Samuel said apologetically, "but the land is good, Miss Ashford. With the right care, it could be something again." Katherine swallowed her disappointment. "My father loved this place. That's enough for me to give it a chance." Samuel helped her with her trunks and introduced her to Elijah, the elderly ranch hand who had stayed on after her father's passing. With promises to return the next day, Samuel departed, leaving Katherine alone in what was now her home. The interior was sparsely furnished but clean. Elijah's wife, Martha, had prepared the house for her arrival, stocking the pantry with basics and leaving a pot of stew warming on the stove. Katherine ate mechanically, too overwhelmed to taste the food, and then collapsed into her father's bed, still dressed in her traveling clothes. Morning came with the insistent crowing of a rooster. Katherine woke disoriented before remembering where she was. She washed quickly, changed into a simple blue dress, and went downstairs to find Elijah waiting on the porch. "Mornin', Miss Ashford," he greeted her. "Thought you might want to see the property today," Katherine nodded. "Yes, please, and I'd like to visit our neighbor, Mr. Harrington, afterward." Elijah's weathered face creased with concern. "Are you sure about that, miss? Mr. Harrington don't take kindly to visitors these days." "Nevertheless, I need to address my father's debt." They spent the morning touring the ranch. Despite its run-down appearance, Katherine could see the potential. The creek that gave the town its name ran through the northern edge of the property, providing reliable water even in dry years. The soil was rich in the valley, perfect for growing hay to supplement the cattle feed. By midday, Katherine had a better understanding of the task before her. It would take hard work and investment, but the ranch could be saved. First, though, she needed to resolve the matter of her father's debt. "The horizon H is just over that ridge," Elijah pointed as they finished their tour. "About a 20-minute ride." "Will you accompany me?" Katherine asked. Elijah shook his head. "Mr. Harrington fired all his hands except for one after his tragedy. He won't appreciate me on his land." "Better you go alone." Katherine hesitated, then nodded. "I'll take one of the horses then." Elijah helped her saddle a gentle mare named Penny. "Just follow the trail. You can't miss the main house. It's the grandest in the territory, or it was before." Katherine rode slowly, gathering her thoughts. She had never met a man broken by grief, and she wasn't sure what to expect. The trail wound through a stand of pines before opening onto a vast meadow. In the distance stood a large 2-story ranch house with wide verandas and a stone chimney. Even from afar, Katherine could see that parts of it had fallen into disrepair, with shutters hanging askew and an untended garden overtaking the front yard. As she approached, she noticed a man chopping wood in the side yard. His back was to her, broad shoulders working rhythmically as the axe rose and fell. He wore no shirt despite the spring chill, his sun-bronzed skin glistening with exertion. Katherine dismounted and tied Penny to a hitching post. The sound of the axe stopped, and she turned to find the man watching her, his face partially shadowed by the brim of his hat. "You're trespassing," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Katherine straightened her spine. "Are you Mr. Harrington?" He didn't answer immediately, just studied her with intense eyes. Finally, he nodded once. "What do you want?" "I'm Katherine Ashford, Edward Ashford's daughter." She took a step forward. "I've come to discuss the matter of my father's debt to you." Something flickered across his face, recognition, perhaps, or memory. He set down the axe and moved closer, emerging fully into the sunlight. Katherine's breath caught. Despite the unkempt beard and the hardness in his eyes, Quentin Harrington was a strikingly handsome man. He couldn't be more than 35, yet there was a weariness about him that aged him beyond his years. "Edward never mentioned a daughter," he said, his voice still gruff. "Nevertheless, here I am, and as his sole heir, I've inherited both his property and his obligations." Quentin's gaze traveled over her, assessing. "You don't look like a rancher." "I wasn't one until yesterday," Katherine admitted, "but I intend to honor my father's commitments." A sound that might have been a laugh escaped him. $500 is a lot of money for a failing ranch. Katherine refused to be intimidated. "I'm aware of the amount, Mr. Harrington. I don't have it in full at present, but I propose a payment arrangement." "I don't need more promises, Miss Ashford. Your father made plenty of those." "These aren't promises. I'm offering you a business proposal." Katherine reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded paper. "I've calculated what I can pay monthly based on projected income from the remaining cattle." Quentin didn't take the paper. Instead, he turned away, grabbing his shirt from where it hung on a nearby fence post. "Keep your calculations." "I have no interest in them." Katherine felt her temper rise. "Mr. Harrington, I've come in good faith to settle an outstanding debt. The least you could do is hear me out." He turned back to her, shirt now buttoned, his expression unreadable. "What I could do, Miss Ashford, is foreclose on your property and be done with it. The debt is secured by a lien on the Circle A. The color drained from Catherine's face. Samuel hadn't mentioned this detail. You wouldn't? I've done worse. His voice was flat. Then why didn't you do it when my father was alive? Why help him at all if you're so callous? The question seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment the hard mask slipped, revealing something raw beneath. Then it was gone, replaced by cold indifference. Your father saved my life once. Before. He didn't need to clarify before what. Consider your debt postponed for 1 month. After that, I expect payment in full or I'll exercise my right to the property. Relief and anxiety warred within Katherine. A month wasn't much time, but it was something. Thank you, Mr. Harrington. He didn't acknowledge her gratitude. You should go, storm's coming. He gestured toward the darkening sky to the west. Katherine returned to Penny and mounted. As she turned to leave, she noticed Quentin watching her, his expression distant. My father thought highly of you, she said. He wrote about your kindness in his letters. Something like pain crossed Quentin's features. Your father didn't know me very well then. Katherine rode back to the Circle with a heavy heart, racing the approaching storm. She made it to the barn just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. As she unsaddled Penny, Elijah appeared in the doorway. How'd it go? He asked, helping her with the tack. He's given me a month to pay the debt in full. Katherine brushed Penny's coat, finding comfort in the repetitive motion. Elijah, did you know the debt was secured by a lien on the property? The old man nodded sadly. Your father didn't want to worry you in his letters. He hoped to recover enough to pay it off before. He trailed off. Before he died, Katherine finished. Well, now it's my problem to solve. She put away the brush and leaned against the stall. Tell me about Quentin Harrington. What was he like before he lost his family? Elijah's weathered face softened with memory. One of the finest men I ever knew, fair to his workers, generous to those in need. He built the school in town, you know. His wife, Clara, was a teacher. They were planning to start the first proper school in the county when the smallpox came through. Katherine thought of the hard-eyed man she'd met today. It was difficult to reconcile him with Elijah's description. The boy was only 4, Elijah continued, his voice growing quieter. Little William, spitting image of his father with his mother's gentle nature. After they passed, something broke in Quentin. He fired most of his hands, let parts of his ranch go to seed. Stopped coming to town except for absolute necessities. Your father was one of the few who could still reach him sometimes. The rain drummed harder on the barn roof. Katherine wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the mild spring air. A month isn't much time to raise $500, she said. Not with the ranch in this condition. Elijah studied her face. You ain't thinking of giving up, are you? Katherine straightened her shoulders. No, this land was important to my father. I won't let it go without a fight. The old ranch hand smiled. Then we'd best get to work. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Katherine threw herself into learning everything she could about ranching. She rode the boundaries of the property with Elijah, counted and assessed the remaining cattle, and took inventory of equipment and supplies. In the evenings, she pored over her father's account books, looking for ways to generate immediate income. On the 4th day, Katherine rode into town to meet with Samuel Porter again and to make inquiries about selling some of her father's personal items to raise cash. As she tied her horse outside the general store, she became aware of the curious glances from townspeople. A woman alone was always an object of interest on the frontier, but Katherine sensed there was more to their scrutiny. Inside the store, she approached the counter where a plump woman with kind eyes greeted her. You must be Edward's daughter, the woman said. I'm Florence Miller. My husband owns this store, Katherine smiled, grateful for the friendly face. Katherine Ashford, it's a pleasure to meet you. We were all sorry to hear about your father. He was well liked in these parts. Thank you, I'm finding that out more each day. Katherine glanced around the store. I was hoping to purchase some supplies and perhaps inquire about selling a few items. Florence's expression turned curious. Selling? Already looking to move on, dear? Not at all. I'm staying to run the ranch, but I need to raise some funds quickly. Understanding dawned on Florence's face. Ah, the debt to Quentin Harrington. Katherine blinked in surprise. News travels fast. In a town this size, breathing is noteworthy, Florence said with a chuckle. What are you looking to sell? My father had a collection of books, some fine leather goods from his days back east, a pocket watch with a gold chain. Florence nodded thoughtfully. Bring them by. My husband can give you a fair price, but honey, I doubt it'll be enough for what you need. Catherine's heart sank. I was afraid of that. There's the spring cattle auction in 3 weeks, Florence offered. If you have any stock worth selling, you might get a decent price there. 3 weeks, Katherine repeated. That doesn't leave much margin for error. Florence patted her hand. Life rarely does, dear. She lowered her voice. Have you considered asking Quentin for more time? He's not an unreasonable man, despite what folks might say. Katherine thought of their brief encounter. I'm not so sure about that. The grief changed him, that's true enough. But underneath all that pain, the good man is still there. I believe that. Florence began gathering Catherine's requested supplies. Clara was my closest friend, you know. She'd be heartbroken to see what Quentin's become. Katherine left the store with her supplies and more questions than answers. She stopped by Samuel Porter's office next, where he confirmed what she already suspected: selling her father's possessions wouldn't come close to covering the debt. The cattle auction is your best bet, Samuel agreed. But even then, with the condition of your herd. I understand, Katherine said, trying not to let her discouragement show. I'll find a way, Mr. Porter. As she prepared to leave town, dark clouds began gathering again. Katherine urged Penny to a faster pace, hoping to outrun the impending downpour. They were halfway back to the circle when the skies opened up. Within minutes, she was soaked to the skin, the trail turning to mud beneath Penny's hooves. A flash of lightning startled the mare, who reared suddenly. Katherine, unprepared, lost her grip and tumbled backward into the mud. Her head struck something hard, a rock or tree root, and for a moment, everything went black. When she came to, she was no longer in the rain. A fire crackled nearby, and she was wrapped in a rough wool blanket. Katherine blinked, disoriented, and tried to sit up. Pain shot through her head, and she groaned. Don't move, a deep voice commanded. Katherine froze, then slowly turned her head toward the sound. Quentin Harrington sat in a chair a few feet away, whittling a piece of wood with a small knife. His eyes, when they met hers, were as stormy as the weather outside. What happened? She asked, her voice coming out as a croak. Your horse threw you. I was checking fence lines nearby and saw it happen. He set aside his whittling and approached, kneeling beside the small cot where she lay. You hit your head. How many fingers am I holding up? 3, she answered, following his raised hand with her eyes. Where am I? Line shack on the northeast corner of my property. It was closer than taking you back to either of our houses in this weather. He stood and moved to a small stove where a pot simmered. Your horse is fine, in the lean-to out back. Katherine attempted to sit up again, more slowly this time. Her head throbbed, but the room remained steady. She realized she was wearing a man's shirt over her mud-soaked dress. Heat rose to her cheeks. I didn't undress you, Quentin said, noticing her discomfort. Just gave you something dry to put over your wet things. Your dress will be ruined if we don't get the mud out soon, though. Thank you, Katherine managed, for helping me. Quentin grunted in response, ladling what appeared to be stew into a tin cup. He brought it to her. It's not fancy, but it's hot. You need to eat something. Katherine accepted the cup, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. She noticed he withdrew his hand quickly, as if burned. The stew was simple venison with root vegetables, but surprisingly good. You're a better cook than I would have expected, she commented, trying to ease the tension. Necessity, he replied shortly. Can't keep a cook when you live alone. They fell into silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the drumming of rain on the roof. Quentin returned to his chair and his whittling, seemingly content to ignore her presence. Katherine studied him surreptitiously. In the warm light of the fire, his features were softer, the hard lines of grief less pronounced. His hands, she noticed, were graceful despite their size and strength, moving with precision as he carved the wood. "What are you making?" she asked when the silence became unbearable. He glanced up as if surprised she was still there. "Nothing important." But he turned the small piece of wood so she could see, a tiny horse taking shape under his knife. "It's beautiful," Katherine said truthfully. "You're quite talented." Quentin's shoulders stiffened. "It passes the time." He set the carving aside and stood abruptly. "Storm's letting up. Once you're finished eating, I'll take you home." Katherine felt a pang of disappointment at his withdrawal. "I don't want to trouble you further. I can find my way back." "It's nearly dark. You've had a head injury and the trail will be muddy. I'm taking you." His tone brooked no argument. True to his word, as soon as the rain reduced to a drizzle, Quentin saddled both horses. He helped Katherine mount, his touch impersonal but gentle, then swung onto his own stallion. They rode in silence, Quentin slightly ahead, leading the way through the gathering dusk. The lights of the circle came into view just as the last daylight faded. Elijah hurried out of the barn as they approached, concern etched on his weathered face. "Miss Katherine, we were about to come looking for you." "I'm fine, Elijah, just a small accident. Mr. Harrington was kind enough to help me." She dismounted carefully, still feeling the effects of her fall. Quentin remained on his horse. She hit her head. "Someone should wake her every few hours tonight just to be safe." Elijah nodded. "Martha and I will take turns checking on her." "Thank you again, Mr. Harrington," Katherine said, looking up at him. For a moment, something unguarded crossed his face, concern, perhaps, or another emotion she couldn't quite name. Then he nodded curtly and turned his horse. "Mr. Harrington," Katherine called after him. When he paused, she continued, "Would you join us for dinner tomorrow?" "As a proper thank you for your help." Quentin stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. "That won't be necessary," he said finally and rode away, disappearing into the night. Elijah helped Katherine into the house, where Martha fussed over her, examining the bump on her head and insisting she change into dry clothes immediately. As she sank into a hot bath later, Katherine found her thoughts returning to Quentin Harrington. The man was a contradiction, capable of kindness, yet determined to appear harsh, skilled at creating beauty, yet living in self-imposed desolation. She had seen a glimpse of the man Elijah described, the man her father had respected. And despite his rejection of her dinner invitation, she wasn't ready to give up on reaching him, not just for the sake of her debt, but because something in his lonely existence called to a similar solitude in her own heart. The next morning, Katherine woke with a pounding headache but otherwise felt improved. True to Quentin's instructions, Martha had checked on her throughout the night. Now, in the clear light of day, the events of the previous evening seemed almost dreamlike. "That man saved your life," Martha said as she helped Katherine dress her hair. "Riding alone in a storm like that, you could have been lying there for hours before anyone found you." Katherine met the older woman's eyes in the mirror. "You sound as if you approve of him." Martha's hands stilled momentarily. Mr. Harrington wasn't always as he is now. What happened to him would break the strongest heart, but a good deed is a good deed, and I won't pretend otherwise. "He refused my dinner invitation," Katherine mused, rather emphatically. "Of course he did," Martha said, securing the last pin. "Man hasn't taken a proper meal with company in 3 years, wouldn't know how to act if he tried." An idea began forming in Katherine's mind. What if the invitation wasn't for dinner at a table but something less formal? Something that wouldn't feel like stepping back into a life he's left behind. Martha gave her a shrewd look. "You're planning something, Miss Katherine. I've raised enough children to recognize that expression." Katherine smiled. "Perhaps I am." "Tell me, Martha, does Mr. Harrington still inspect his fences regularly?" "Every Tuesday and Friday, from what Elijah says. Creatures of habit, men like that. And today is Friday," Katherine noted, standing up. "Thank you, Martha, you've been most helpful." Despite Martha's protests that she should rest after her accident, Katherine spent the morning in the kitchen. By noon, She had packed a basket with freshly baked bread, cold chicken, preserves, and 2 slices of apple pie that Martha had made the day before. She saddled Penny, who seemed none the worse for yesterday's adventure, and set off toward the northeast corner of the Horizon H. The day was clear and mild, perfect spring weather after the previous day's storm. Katherine followed the route she remembered, watching for any sign of Quentin. She found him exactly where she'd guessed he might be at the line shack, replacing boards damaged in yesterday's downpour. He looked up as she approached, his expression flickering between surprise and wariness. "Miss Ashford, should you be riding so soon after your fall?" Katherine dismounted, lifting the basket. "I feel much improved, thank you, and I've brought lunch since you declined dinner." Quentin set down his hammer, studying her with those intense eyes. "You rode all the way out here to bring me lunch." "To thank you properly for your help yesterday," she corrected, "and perhaps to discuss our business matter further." His jaw tightened. "I've already given you a month, that hasn't changed. I understand that. But I thought we might talk about alternative arrangements if I'm unable to raise the full amount in time." Quentin's gaze moved from her face to the basket and back again. She could almost see him weighing his desire for solitude against his ingrained manners. Finally, he sighed. "I suppose I should eat something," he conceded. Katherine smiled in triumph and spread a blanket on the ground nearby. Quentin washed his hands at the pump outside the shack, then joined her, sitting at a careful distance. He accepted the plate she offered with a gruff thanks. "This is good bread," he said after a few bites. "Did you make it?" Katherine nodded. "My mother taught me before she passed. She said a woman should know how to make bread even if she never needs to." "Your mother was wise," Quentin said quietly. "My Clara felt the same way. She could have hired a cook, we had the means, but she insisted on making our bread herself." It was the first time he had voluntarily mentioned his wife. Katherine treaded carefully. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. He fell silent, focusing on his food. Katherine decided to change the subject. "I've been reviewing my father's accounts. The ranch was doing well until the drought and cattle fever hit. With proper management and some investment, it could be profitable again." Quentin glanced at her. "Ranching isn't easy work, especially for a woman alone. Most would sell and return east." "I'm not most women, Mr. Harrington." The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "No, I don't suppose you are." He set his empty plate aside. "What's your proposal then?" Katherine took a deep breath. "I can pay $100 now from my personal savings. For the remainder, I propose to work it off either through labor on your property or by allocating a percentage of my future profits until the debt is satisfied." Quentin studied her for a long moment. "You'd work as a hired hand to keep your father's ranch." "I'd do whatever is necessary," Katherine said firmly. The land was important to him. "It's my heritage now." Something shifted in Quentin's expression. "I admire your determination, Miss Ashford, misplaced though it may be." He stood, brushing crumbs from his trousers. "I'll consider your proposal, that's all I can offer for now." Katherine knew it was the best she could hope for. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington." She began packing up the remains of their lunch. "I left you a slice of pie for later." He accepted the wrapped pie with unexpected grace. "You didn't have to do that. Consider it interest on my debt," she said lightly. As she mounted Penny to leave, Quentin approached, resting a hand on the mare's neck. "Be careful riding back, the ground's still soft in places." Their eyes met, and for a moment Katherine glimpsed vulnerability beneath his guarded expression. Then he stepped back, the mask falling into place once more. "Good day, Miss Ashford." "Good day, Mr. Harrington." Katherine rode away with her heart beating faster than the mild exertion warranted. She had made progress, small, perhaps, but real. He had listened to her proposal and even shown concern for her safety. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. Over the next week, Katherine threw herself into preparing for the cattle auction. She and Elijah selected the best of their small herd to sell, working to improve their condition with extra feed. Katherine used some of her dwindling savings to purchase medicine for a calf showing signs of illness. knowing they needed every animal to be at its best. She made 2 more trips to the Horizon H, ostensibly to check on fence lines where their properties met, but always managing to encounter Quentin. Each time she brought something small: cookies Martha had baked, a book from her father's collection she thought he might enjoy, once even a cutting from a rosebush she'd discovered on the circle of property. "Clara had roses," he'd said when she presented the cutting, his voice rough with memory. "All along the front of the house." "Perhaps these came from hers originally," Katherine had suggested gently. "My father mentioned getting cuttings from a neighbor years ago." Quentin had accepted the small plant with careful hands. "Thank you," he'd said, the words seeming to surprise even him. Each encounter chipped away at the wall he'd built around himself. He never sought her out, but he no longer seemed to resent her presence. They spoke of practical matters: the weather, the condition of the range, the approaching auction. Once, he even offered advice on treating the sick calf. "Whiskey and molasses," he'd said, "mixed with warm water. My father swore by it for calves with lung ailments." The remedy had worked, and Katherine had made a special trip to tell him so. She found him mending tack in the barn, a task she'd learned to do herself in recent days. "The calf is much improved," she reported, leaning against the barn door. "Your father's remedy was effective," Quentin nodded, his hands continuing their skilled work. "Good, you'll need every animal healthy for the auction." Katherine moved closer, watching his methodical stitching. "You haven't given me your answer about my proposal." His hands stilled momentarily. "I've been thinking about it." And Quentin set the leather aside and looked up at her. "I'll make you a counter-offer. I'll reduce the debt to $400, payable after the auction. If you can't raise it all, I'll accept a partial payment and allow monthly installments on the remainder." Relief washed through Katherine. "That's more than fair, thank you," he shrugged, returning to his work. "Your father was a good man, he would have done the same for me." Katherine sat on a hay bale near him. "Tell me about him, how you knew each other." Quentin's hands moved rhythmically as he spoke. "We met during a blizzard winter of '67. I was new to the territory, got caught in the storm while checking a remote pasture. Would have frozen to death if Edward hadn't found me and brought me to his cabin." "That sounds like my father," Katherine said softly, "always helping others." "He talked about you," Quentin continued, surprising her. "Worried he'd made a mistake staying out here instead of returning east to be near you, but he loved this land too much to leave it." "I understand that now," Katherine admitted. "I never thought I would, but there's something about this place. It gets under your skin." Quentin glanced at her, his expression softening slightly. "That it does." They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, the only sound the creak of leather as Quentin worked. Finally, Katherine stood. "I should get back. We're bringing the auction cattle in tomorrow." Quentin nodded. "The north pasture has better grass right now, might fatten them up a bit more before the sale." "I'll tell Elijah," Katherine promised. At the barn door she paused. "Will you be at the auction?" "I hadn't planned on it." "You should come," she said impulsively. "I could use your expertise." Quentin looked skeptical. "Town's not my favorite place these days." "Think about it," Katherine suggested. "It might be good for you too. Reconnect." Before he could refuse outright, she left, feeling his eyes on her back as she rode away. The day of the auction dawned clear and warm. Katherine woke before sunrise, nervous energy propelling her through her morning routine. She chose her clothes carefully, a practical riding skirt and jacket, but in a flattering shade of deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes. Her hair she braided and pinned up neatly under a wide-brimmed hat. "You look mighty fine, Miss Katherine," Martha commented as she served breakfast. "Anyone would think you were trying to impress someone." Katherine felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "I merely want to present a professional appearance for the auction. First impressions matter in business." Martha's knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled. "Of course, dear." Katherine, Elijah, and the temporary hand they'd hired for the day drove their small herd to town early. The auction wouldn't start until noon, but they needed time to settle the cattle and register with the auctioneer. Catherine's stomach twisted with anxiety as they entered the fairgrounds where the auction would be held. Everything depended on today. The grounds were already bustling with activity, ranchers large and small bringing in their stock, buyers examining the offerings, merchants setting up stands to sell food and supplies to the crowd. Catherine registered her cattle and received a number that would identify her stock during the auction. As she walked among the pens, assessing the competition, she overheard whispered comments. "That's Edward Ashford's daughter. Taking on the ranch herself, can you imagine? Harrington's going to foreclose anyway, mark my words." Catherine held her head high, ignoring the gossip. She checked on her cattle one last time, ensuring they looked their best, then made her way to the auction arena. The stands were filling up, ranchers and townspeople alike turning the event into a social occasion. Catherine scanned the crowd, looking for one particular face, but saw no sign of Quentin. She tried to ignore her disappointment. It had been foolish to hope he would come. The man barely left his property. Why would he subject himself to the scrutiny and chatter of a public event just because she had asked? The auction began with smaller lots, a few goats, some horses, then individual cattle. Catherine listened carefully to the bids, getting a feel for the market. Prices seemed decent, not exceptional but better than she had feared. When her number was finally called, she stood a little straighter, watching as her small herd was driven into the arena. The auctioneer described the cattle in glowing terms, emphasizing their health and potential. Bidding started slowly but picked up as buyers recognized the quality of the stock. Catherine held her breath as the price climbed steadily. When the gavel finally fell, she did a quick calculation. The sale would bring in just over $300. Not enough to pay off Quentin entirely, but a substantial amount. Relief and disappointment mingled as she made her way to the auctioneer's clerk to finalize the transaction. As she waited in line, a familiar voice spoke behind her. "Fair price for those cattle. You did well." Catherine turned, unable to hide her surprise and pleasure. "Mr. Harrington, you came." Quentin looked uncomfortable in the crowd, his hat pulled low over his eyes as if to avoid recognition. He wore a clean shirt and vest, his beard trimmed neater than she had yet seen it. "Said I'd think about it," he muttered. "I'm glad you did," she said sincerely. "What did you think of the auction? Prices are better than last year. Good time to sell." He glanced around, clearly ill at ease with the curious stares they were attracting. "You'll have enough to make a substantial payment." $312, Catherine confirmed. "I'll bring it to you tomorrow." Quentin nodded. "That leaves only 88. We can work out terms for the remainder." They had reached the front of the line. Catherine completed her transaction, pocketing the bank draft with a feeling of accomplishment. When she turned back, Quentin was still waiting. "Have you eaten?" he asked unexpectedly. Catherine blinked in surprise. "No, I've been too nervous to think about food." "There's a decent place across from the livery. Not fancy, but the food's good." He seemed almost embarrassed by the invitation. "I'd like that," Catherine said, trying not to sound too eager. They walked together through the crowded fairgrounds, drawing curious glances from townspeople unaccustomed to seeing the ghost in public, much less in female company. Quentin kept his gaze straight ahead, but Catherine noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand occasionally brushed the revolver at his hip as if seeking reassurance. The restaurant was small and simple, but clean. They were seated at a table by the window, and Quentin positioned himself so he could see both the door and the street outside. Old habits, Catherine supposed, from days when he had been more engaged with the world and its potential dangers. Conversation flowed more easily than she had expected. Quentin asked about her plans for the ranch, and Catherine shared her ideas for diversifying, adding a small orchard, perhaps some chickens for eggs to sell in town. He listened attentively, occasionally offering practical suggestions. "You've thought this through," he commented after she outlined her 5-year vision for the Circle A. "I had a lot of time to plan on the journey west," Catherine explained. And while I may not have ranching experience, I do understand business. My mother's brother owned a shipping company in Boston. I helped with the accounts from the time I was 16. Quentin seemed impressed. Most women would have sold the ranch and returned east. As you've mentioned before, Katherine reminded him with a smile. But I've found I rather like it here. There's a freedom to this life that I never had in Boston. Something in her words seemed to resonate with him. I felt the same way when I first came west, like I could breathe properly for the first time. His gaze drifted to the window, to the distant mountains. Clara felt it too. That's why we stayed, even when her parents begged us to return to Philadelphia after William was born. Catherine's heart ached at the mention of his family. They sound wonderful, she said softly. Quentin's expression closed slightly, but he didn't retreat entirely. They were the best of me, he refocused on her, the part worth anything anyway. I don't believe that, Katherine said quietly. The man who's helped me these past weeks, who saved me from the storm, who offered fair terms on my debt, that man has value too. Color rose in Quentin's face, and he looked away. You're a kind woman, Miss Ashford. Too kind, perhaps. They finished their meal in comfortable silence. As they walked back to the fairgrounds, Katherine felt a curious lightness in her chest. Something had shifted between them today, a tentative trust established, perhaps, or the first fragile shoots of friendship taking root. At the livery where Katherine had left Penny, they paused. I should get back to the ranch, she said, reluctant to end their time together. Elijah will be wondering where I've gone. Quentin nodded. I'll ride with you if you don't mind the company. Our paths go the same way for most of the journey. I'd welcome it, Katherine said truthfully. They rode side by side through the golden afternoon, talking occasionally but mostly enjoying the peaceful landscape. When they reached the fork where their paths would diverge, Quentin reined in his horse. I've been thinking about your proposal, he said, about working off part of the debt. Katherine waited, hopeful. My south pasture fence needs replacing. It's a big job, more than I can handle alone. He looked at her directly. If you and Elijah help with that, I'll consider the remaining debt paid. Joy surged through Katherine. That's more than fair, thank you. Don't thank me yet, it's hard work. But there was a hint of amusement in his eyes that she'd never seen before. We'll start next week, she promised. After I've delivered the payment from today's sale, Quentin nodded. Monday morning, I'll have the supplies ready. He hesitated, then added, and Katherine, it was the first time he'd used her given name. The sound of it in his deep voice sent a shiver down her spine. Yes, you did well today. Your father would be proud. Before she could respond, he touched the brim of his hat in farewell and turned his horse toward the horizon. Katherine watched him go, a strange mix of emotions swirling within her. Pride at his approval, warmth at the sound of her name on his lips, and something else, something that felt dangerously like the first stirrings of affection. The work on Quentin's fence began as promised the following Monday. Katherine arrived with Elijah and his teenage nephew, James, whom they'd hired to help with the heavier labor. Quentin had the supplies neatly organized: new fence posts, rolls of wire, tools for digging post holes and stretching wire. We'll start at the southeast corner, he instructed, all business. Work our way north, then across to the west. Should take about 2 weeks if the weather holds. Katherine nodded, pulling on work gloves. Just tell us what to do. The work was indeed hard, harder than anything Katherine had attempted before. By midday, her hands were blistered despite the gloves, and every muscle protested. But she refused to complain or slack off. When Quentin called a break for lunch, she sank gratefully onto a fallen log, accepting the canteen he offered. You're working too hard, he observed, sitting beside her. This isn't women's work. Katherine bristled slightly. I'm perfectly capable. I didn't say you weren't capable, Quentin corrected. Just that you don't need to push yourself to exhaustion to prove a point. And what point would that be? That you're as tough as any man. His eyes held a hint of amusement. I'm already convinced, Katherine, you can ease up a bit. The casual use of her name again sent warmth through her that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. "I'll consider it," she said, trying to sound dignified despite her dirt-smudged face and sweaty clothes. Quentin's mouth twitched. "Stubborn woman." "Takes one to know one," she retorted without thinking. To her astonishment, Quentin laughed a real laugh that transformed his face, erasing years of grief and hardship for one brief, shining moment. Katherine stared, transfixed by the change. Then, realizing she was gaping, she quickly looked away. The days fell into a pattern. They would work from sunup until mid-afternoon, break for a late lunch that Martha packed, then continue until dusk approached. Each day the fence extended further, a tangible measure of their progress. And each day, Quentin seemed to thaw a little more, his gruff manner giving way to occasional smiles and even, rarely, laughter. By the end of the first week, Katherine had developed calluses on her hands and a deep tan on her face and neck. She also had developed a growing awareness of Quentin that made her pulse quicken whenever he worked alongside her. She found herself watching his hands, strong, capable hands that could drive a post into hard earth or gently untangle wire without breaking it. She noticed the way the sun bronzed his skin, the way his shirt clung to his broad shoulders when damp with exertion, the rare smile that transformed his serious face. On the Saturday marking the end of their first week of work, Quentin surprised them all by inviting them to stay for dinner. "Martha packed enough for an army," Katherine protested. "We shouldn't impose." "It's not an imposition," Quentin said firmly. "Besides, I want to show you something after we eat. Consider it part of our arrangement." Curious, Katherine agreed. They ate at a rough table outside the main house, a simple meal of beans, cornbread, and coffee, but satisfying after a day of hard work. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in vivid oranges and pinks, Quentin stood. "Come with me," he said to Katherine. To Elijah and James, he added, "We won't be long. Help yourselves to more coffee." Katherine followed him around the house and up a gentle slope to where a small cluster of apple trees stood in full bloom, their branches heavy with fragrant white blossoms. Beyond the orchard, a breathtaking view spread out, rolling hills giving way to the distant mountains, all bathed in the golden light of sunset. "It's beautiful," Katherine breathed. "Clara loved this spot," Quentin said quietly. "Said it was the reason she agreed to marry me and come west. I proposed to her right here under these trees." Katherine glanced at him, touched that he would share something so personal. "Thank you for showing me." Quentin gazed at the view, his expression distant. "I haven't been up here in 3 years, couldn't bear it." He took a deep breath. "But today, I found myself wanting to see it again, wanting to share it." The significance of his words wasn't lost on Katherine. This was more than just showing her a pretty view. It was Quentin allowing himself to revisit a cherished memory, to reconnect with a part of his past he had walled off in grief. "Your wife had excellent taste," Katherine said softly. Quentin turned to her, the setting sun gilding his features. "Yes, she did." His eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "She would have liked you, I think. Strong-minded women understand each other." "I wish I could have known her," Katherine said truthfully. "So do I." Quentin's voice was rough with emotion. He cleared his throat. "We should get back, it'll be dark soon." As they walked down the hill, Katherine felt his hand brush hers, not quite taking it, but a deliberate touch nonetheless. Her heart fluttered at the contact, brief as it was. Something was changing between them, something tender and fragile and new. The second week of fence building proceeded much like the first, except that the easy camaraderie between them deepened. They worked well together now, anticipating each other's needs, communicating sometimes without words. In the evenings, Katherine found herself reluctant to leave, often lingering over coffee, discussing ranch business, or sometimes simply sitting in comfortable silence as darkness fell. On the Friday marking the end of their project, they finished the last stretch of fence by mid-afternoon. Quentin drove the final staple into the post, then straightened, surveying their work with satisfaction. "Looks good," he declared. Better than the original, even, Elijah nodded in agreement. Should last 20 years, that fence. Then our debt is paid in full. Katherine asked, removing her work gloves. Quentin met her gaze steadily. The debt is satisfied, yes. Something in his tone suggested he was speaking of more than just money. Before Katherine could respond, James called out from where he was loading tools into the wagon. Riders coming. They all turned to see 3 men on horseback approaching from the direction of town. Quentin's posture instantly tensed, his hand moving to rest on his revolver. "Stay here," he instructed Katherine, moving to intercept the riders. Katherine ignored his command, following a few paces behind. She recognized the lead rider as Bradford Collins, owner of the largest ranch in the territory and president of the Cattlemen's Association. He was an imposing man in his 50s, known for his shrewd business practices. "Harrington," Collins called in greeting as they drew near. "Been a while." "Collins," Quentin acknowledged coolly. "What brings you out this way?" Collins dismounted, his companions remaining on horseback. "Business proposition. Heard you've been fixing up the place again." His gaze flickered to Katherine with undisguised curiosity. "Miss Ashford, isn't it?" "Edward's daughter. My condolences on your loss." "Thank you, Mr. Collins," Katherine replied, moving to stand beside Quentin. She felt his surprise at her boldness but didn't back down. Collins looked between them, a calculating gleam in his eye. "Interesting partnership you two have formed." "The talk of the county, I might add." "State your business, Collins," Quentin said tersely. "Very well." Collins straightened his vest. "The railroad's coming through, Harrington. Northern Pacific is extending the spur from Helena right through this valley. They're looking for land for a depot and stockyards." Quentin's expression didn't change. And they're particularly interested in the southeast corner of your property. It's flat, close to the creek and a natural junction point. They're prepared to pay handsomely." Katherine felt Quentin stiffen beside her. The southeast corner where the orchard stood, where he had proposed to Clara. "Not interested," Quentin said flatly. Collins frowned. "You haven't even heard the offer. $5,000 for 80 acres. That's far above market rate." "The land's not for sale, at any price." Quentin's voice was cold. Collins sighed dramatically. "I figured you'd say that. That's why I brought this." He reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope which he extended to Quentin. "Court order. The railroad can exercise eminent domain if necessary. I'm giving you the courtesy of a private sale first." Quentin didn't take the envelope. "Get off my land, Collins." Collins's expression hardened. "Don't be a fool, Harrington. This is happening whether you like it or not. The only question is whether you profit from it or fight a losing battle in court." He placed the envelope on a fence post. "You have 1 week to reconsider. After that, the offer drops to 3,000 and the legal proceedings begin." He remounted his horse with practiced ease. "Good day to you both. Miss Ashford, a pleasure to meet you despite the circumstances." The 3 men rode away, leaving behind a tense silence. Quentin stared at the envelope as if it might burst into flames. Finally, Katherine reached for it. "May I?" she asked quietly. Quentin nodded, his jaw clenched tight. Katherine opened the envelope and scanned the legal document inside. It was exactly as Collins had described, a notice of intent to acquire the land through eminent domain if a voluntary sale couldn't be arranged. "It's about the orchard, isn't it?" Katherine asked gently. "That's why you won't sell." Quentin's eyes, when they met hers, were filled with a pain so raw it took her breath away. "I can't let them tear it down. I can't." Katherine touched his arm tentatively. "Then we'll find another way." "We." Quentin looked down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face. "Yes, we," Katherine said firmly. "You helped me when I needed it. Now it's my turn." For a long moment, Quentin just looked at her, a complex mix of emotions playing across his features. Then, to Katherine's surprise, he covered her hand with his own. "Thank you," he said simply. That evening, after Elijah and James had gone home, Katherine stayed at the Horizon H. She and Quentin sat at his kitchen table, poring over maps of the property and the legal documents Collins had left. "The railroad has a strong case," Katherine admitted reluctantly. The proposed route makes logical sense and they can argue public interest. Quentin ran a hand through his hair in frustration. So I just have to accept it. Watch them tear down Clara's trees, build their depot where we stood together. Katherine studied the map thoughtfully. Maybe not. Look here, your northern boundary follows the creek for about a mile before it turns south. That land is just as flat, just as accessible, and it wouldn't require removing the orchard. It's further from town, Quentin pointed out. By less than a mile, Katherine countered. And it has a better water supply for the steam engines. We could propose it as an alternative. Quentin looked at her with newfound respect. You know about railroads, Katherine smiled slightly. My uncle's shipping company worked closely with the railroads in Boston. I picked up a few things. Collins won't like it, Quentin warned. He's got his mind set on that particular parcel. Collins isn't the railroad, Katherine reminded him. He's just the middleman. If we can make a compelling case directly to Northern Pacific, we might bypass him entirely. Quentin considered this, tracing the alternate route on the map with his finger. It could work, he admitted. But we'd need to move fast. Collins gave us a week, but he'll be working to solidify his position in the meantime. Then we leave for Helena tomorrow, Katherine decided. The railroad's territorial office is there. We can present our alternative directly. Quentin raised an eyebrow. Yes, Katherine said firmly. Unless you'd rather go alone, a slow smile spread across Quentin's face, transforming his features. No, I wouldn't rather go alone. He reached across the table and took her hand. Thank you, Katherine, for all of this. The warmth of his hand around hers sent a flutter through Katherine's chest. You don't need to thank me, she said softly. That's what friends do for each other, friends. The words seemed inadequate for what she was beginning to feel for Quentin Harrington, but it was all she dared to claim for now. They left for Helena early the next morning, a 2-day journey by horseback. Katherine had sent word to Elijah about their plans, packing only what she could carry in her saddlebags. The road was rough in places but passable, winding through valleys and over hills toward the territorial capital. They made camp the first night by a small stream, Quentin efficiently setting up a simple shelter and building a fire while Katherine prepared a meal from their provisions. As they sat beside the fire after eating, the stars appearing one by one in the darkening sky, Katherine found herself studying Quentin's profile in the flickering light. He had changed in the weeks since she'd first met him, not just in appearance, though his beard was now neatly trimmed and his clothes cleaner. There was a vitality to him that had been missing before, a sense of purpose. The grief was still there, visible in quiet moments, but it no longer seemed to consume him. "What are you thinking?" Quentin asked, catching her gaze. Katherine considered deflecting but decided on honesty instead. "I was thinking about how different you seem from when we first met." "Different how?" He turned to face her fully. "More present," she tried to explain. "Before, it was like you were going through the motions of living without actually being alive. Now you seem more engaged with the world." Quentin was silent for a long moment, poking at the fire with a stick. "I was lost," he finally said, his voice low. "After Clara and William died, I couldn't see any reason to keep going. Every day was just enduring, existing." "What changed?" Katherine asked softly. His eyes, when they met hers, were intense in the firelight. "You," he said simply. "You rode onto my property with your determination and your kindness, and you wouldn't let me stay lost." Katherine's breath caught. "Quentin, I'm not saying I'm healed," he continued quickly. "The grief is still there. I still miss them every day. But for the first time in 3 years, I'm also thinking about the future, wanting things again." "What things?" Katherine asked, her heart pounding. Quentin hesitated, then reached out to touch her cheek gently. "Things I have no right to want," he murmured. "A second chance I don't deserve." Katherine leaned into his touch. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Quentin, even you, especially you." For a long moment they stayed like that, his hand warm against her skin, their gazes locked in the firelight. Then Quentin slowly withdrew his hand. "We should get some sleep," he said, his voice rough. Long ride tomorrow, Katherine nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. You're right. As she settled into her bedroll, Katherine replayed the moment in her mind. He cared for her, she was certain of that now. But he was still holding back, still fighting his own sense of loyalty to his lost family. Patience, she reminded herself. Some wounds took time to heal. They reached Helena by mid-afternoon the next day. The territorial capital was larger and more developed than Silverwood Creek, with brick buildings, boardwalks, and a bustle of activity that reminded Katherine of eastern cities. They found accommodations at her respectable hotel's separate rooms, of course, and made inquiries about the Northern Pacific Railroad office. Their chief engineer is a man named Whitcomb, the hotel clerk informed them. Has an office on Last Chance Gulch, can't miss it, big sign out front. After refreshing themselves from the journey, they made their way to the railroad office. It was housed in a new 2-story building with large windows and an imposing facade. Inside, they were greeted by a young clerk who seemed skeptical of their request for a meeting. Mr. Whitcomb is extremely busy, he said, eyeing their travel-worn appearance. He generally only meets with official representatives or major landholders. I am Quentin Harrington, owner of the Horizon H Ranch, Quentin stated firmly. The Northern Pacific is proposing to route through my property. I believe that qualifies me for a meeting. The clerk's demeanor changed immediately. Mr. Harrington? Yes, sir. Mr. Whitcomb mentioned your name just yesterday. Please follow me. They were shown into a spacious office where a bespectacled man in his 40s sat behind a desk covered with maps and blueprints. He stood as they entered, extending his hand. Mr. Harrington, what an unexpected pleasure. I'm Edward Whitcomb, chief engineer for the Northern Pacific's Montana expansion. He glanced curiously at Katherine, Miss Katherine Ashford, Quentin introduced her. Owner of the neighboring Circle, a ranch, and my business associate. Whitcomb raised an eyebrow but shook Katherine's hand. A pleasure, Miss Ashford. Please, both of you, sit down. What can I do for you? Quentin got straight to the point. We're here about your proposed depot location on my property. I understand Bradford Collins has been negotiating on your behalf. Whitcomb adjusted his spectacles. Mr. Collins has indeed been acting as our local representative. He indicated you might be reluctant to sell. I am opposed to the specific location, not necessarily to having the railroad on my land, Quentin clarified. We've come to propose an alternative site that would better serve your needs while preserving an area of personal significance to me. Interest sparked in Whitcomb's eyes. I'm listening. Katherine unrolled the map they had brought, pointing out their proposed alternative. This northern section offers several advantages: better water access for your steam engines, naturally level ground requiring minimal preparation, and direct access to existing cattle trails. Whitcomb examined the map carefully, then compared it to his own survey documents. Interesting, he murmured. Our surveyors did note this area as a secondary option. Then why wasn't it presented to me? Quentin asked. Whitcomb looked uncomfortable. Mr. Collins was quite insistent on the southern location, said it had strategic advantages for local development. For his development, you mean? Katherine interjected. The southern location is closer to Collins's own holdings. He stands to profit significantly if the depot is built there. That would explain his enthusiasm, Whitcomb acknowledged dryly. We entrusted him to negotiate fairly, but it appears his personal interests may have colored his recommendations. So you'll consider our alternative, Quentin pressed. Whitcomb studied the map again. It has merit. The water access alone is a significant advantage. He looked up at them. I'll need to send my own surveyors to verify the conditions, but if everything is as you've described, I see no reason not to approve the change. Relief washed over Katherine. She glanced at Quentin and saw the same emotion reflected in his eyes. How soon can your surveyors visit? She asked. I can have a team there by early next week, Whitcomb promised. In the meantime, I'll instruct Mr. Collins to cease negotiations for the southern parcel. Thank you, Quentin said sincerely. As they left the railroad office, Katherine could barely contain her excitement. "We did it," she exclaimed once they were on the street. Quentin's smile was wide and genuine. "We did." Without warning, he swept her into a brief embrace, lifting her feet off the ground. "Thank you," he said as he set her down, his hands lingering on her waist. Katherine laughed, breathless from the unexpected display of affection. "You're welcome, though I think Mr. Whitcomb was already suspicious of Collins's motives. Still, we might have lost the orchard if not for you." Quentin's expression sobered. "I can never repay you for that." "There's nothing to repay," Katherine assured him. "Friends help each other, remember?" Quentin studied her face intently. "Is that what we are, friends?" Katherine's heart quickened at his tone. "I'd like to think so, unless," he prompted when she hesitated. Katherine gathered her courage. "Unless you'd prefer we were something more." The world seemed to still around them, the bustling street fading into the background as they stood facing each other. Quentin's expression softened, vulnerability replacing caution in his eyes. "I would," he said quietly. "God help me, I would, but I need to be sure, Katherine, sure that I'm ready, sure that it's fair to you." Katherine understood then. He wasn't rejecting her, he was protecting her from himself, from his grief, from the fear that he couldn't love fully again. "I'm not asking for promises, Quentin," she said gently, "just possibility, the chance to see where this might lead." He took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "Possibility," he repeated. "I can offer that." They spent another day in Helena, taking care of business matters and enjoying the amenities of the city. That evening, Quentin took Katherine to dinner at the hotel's restaurant, a proper dinner, with fine china and candles on the table. They talked easily, sharing stories from their pasts, discovering common interests and experiences. "My father wanted me to marry a shipping magnate twice my age," Katherine confided over dessert. "That's partly why I was so eager to come west when he died. To escape the life others had planned for me." "And now," Quentin asked, "do you ever regret your decision?" Katherine shook her head. "Not for a moment. Even with all the challenges, I've found something here I never had in Boston: independence, purpose, a sense that my life is my own to shape." "You've certainly shaped mine," Quentin said softly. "When you first rode onto my property, I thought you were just another complication. I never imagined you'd become essential." The word hung between them, weighted with meaning. Katherine felt warmth bloom in her chest at his admission. "Is that what I am?" she asked. "Essential," Quentin reached across the table, taking her hand. "Increasingly so," he admitted. "It terrifies me, Katherine. I thought I'd never feel this way again, never want to. And now I'm afraid of losing something precious a second time." Katherine squeezed his hand. "We can't live in fear of what might happen, Quentin. We can only embrace what's here now." His eyes held hers, dark and intent. "I'm trying," he promised. "For you, I'm trying." They left Helena the next morning, the journey back to their ranches more leisurely than their urgent trip out. They stopped often, Quentin pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of his early days in the territory. Each mile seemed to bring them closer, not just to home but to each other. When they arrived at the fork in the road where their paths would normally diverge, Quentin to the Horizon H, Katherine to the Circle, they both reined in their horses. "Would you come to the ranch?" Quentin asked. "There's something I want to show you before you go home." "Curious," Katherine agreed. They rode to the Horizon H together, arriving as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Quentin led her to the barn, where he retrieved a small wooden box before guiding her up the hill to the apple orchard. The trees were still in bloom, their white petals occasionally drifting down in the gentle breeze. Quentin led Katherine to a particularly large tree at the center of the grove, where he stopped and turned to face her. "This was Clara's favorite," he said, his voice soft with memory. "We planted it the day after our wedding. She used to say it would grow with our family, marking the years of our life together." Katherine's heart ached for him. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. Quentin opened the box he carried, revealing a small silver locket. "This was hers," he explained. "I've kept it put away since they died." couldn't bear to look at it. He gently lifted the locket from the box, its chain glinting in the late afternoon sunlight. "She would want me to move forward," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "to find happiness again. It's taken me 3 years to accept that." Katherine stood very still, sensing the importance of this moment. "And have you accepted it?" Quentin met her gaze directly. "I'm beginning to, because of you." He stepped closer, the locket dangling from his fingers. "Clara would have liked you," he said again. "Your strength, your kindness. She wouldn't want me to shut myself away from love out of misplaced loyalty to her memory." Katherine could scarcely breathe. "What are you saying, Quentin?" "I'm saying that I care for you, Katherine. More than I thought possible, more than I allowed myself to believe I could." He took another step, closing the distance between them. "I'm saying that if you're willing to be patient with a broken man who's learning to live again, I'd like to see where this journey leads us." Tears pricked at Katherine's eyes. "I care for you too," she whispered, "and I have all the patience in the world for you." Quentin smiled, a smile that reached his eyes and erased the shadows there. "May I?" he asked, holding up the locket. Katherine nodded, turning so he could fasten it around her neck. The metal was cool against her skin, a tangible symbol of the trust he was placing in her in them. When she turned back to face him, Quentin's expression was tender. Slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers, a gentle kiss, tentative at first, then deepening as Katherine responded. His arms went around her waist, drawing her closer, while hers circled his neck. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Quentin rested his forehead against hers. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he murmured. "Neither did I," Katherine confessed. "I never expected you." They stood together in the orchard as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of gold and crimson. The trees around them whispered in the evening breeze, witnesses to a new beginning, a second chance at love for two souls who had found each other against all odds. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn day, Katherine stood in the same orchard, watching as Quentin placed a small wooden marker beneath Clara's favorite tree. It bore 2 names, Clara and William Harrington, with dates of birth and death carefully engraved. "It's time they had a proper memorial," Quentin said as he rose to stand beside her. "Somewhere I can visit, remember them, but also move forward." Katherine squeezed his hand. "They'll always be part of you, part of us." Quentin nodded, his expression peaceful. "They are, but so is our future." Much had changed in the months since their return from Helena. The railroad surveyors had approved their alternative location, and construction had begun on the northern edge of Quentin's property. The settlement from the railroad company had allowed both of them to make improvements to their ranch's new breeding stock, repaired buildings, even 2 new ranch hands to help with the expanding work. But the most significant change had been in their relationship. What had begun as reluctant cooperation had blossomed into deep love and mutual respect. They spent most evenings together now, alternating between their 2 homes, planning and dreaming of a shared future. The townspeople had gradually adjusted to seeing the ghost among them again, especially when he was accompanied by the determined Miss Ashford. The gossip had faded as people recognized the positive changes in Quentin, his re-engagement with community matters, his fair business practices, his occasional smile. "Shall we head back?" Katherine asked as the sun began to set. "Martha's expecting us for dinner." Quentin didn't move immediately, his gaze still on the marker. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about the future, our future." Katherine's heart quickened. "Oh," he turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "The circle and the horizon H share nearly 3 miles of boundary," he began. "It seems inefficient to maintain them as separate operations when they could be stronger together." Katherine's lips twitched with amusement. "Are you proposing a business merger, Mr. Harrington?" "Among other things," he replied, his eyes twinkling. Then his expression softened, became serious. "I love you, Katherine Ashford. You found me at my lowest point, broken by grief, and you didn't turn away. You showed me that my heart could beat again, that I could find joy again." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. "I'm asking if you'll build a life with me, not just merging our ranches, but our hearts, our futures." He opened the box, revealing a delicate gold ring with a single perfect diamond. "Will you marry me, Katherine?" Tears sprang to her eyes as joy flooded through her. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Quentin, with all my heart, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that still took her breath away. When they finally parted, both were smiling. "When?" Katherine asked, admiring the ring on her finger. "Christmas?" Quentin suggested. "That gives us time to prepare and to enjoy being engaged. Christmas would be perfect," she agreed. "A new beginning at year's end." They walked hand in hand down the hill toward the house, the fading sunlight gilding them in gold. Behind them, the orchard stood peaceful in the gathering dusk, its trees now heavy with ripe apples instead of blossoms, a testament to the changing seasons, to growth and renewal, to second chances. Their wedding day dawned clear and cold, with a fresh dusting of snow transforming the landscape into a glistening wonderland. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, held in the small church Quentin had once helped build. Katherine wore a gown of ivory satin trimmed with lace, her mother's pearl earrings, and Clara's locket something old, something borrowed, a connection to the past that blessed their future. Quentin waited for her at the altar, tall and handsome in a new black suit, his face alight with love as she walked toward him on Elijah's arm. When they exchanged vows, his voice was steady and sure, all doubt and hesitation long since vanished. "I, Quentin, take you, Katherine, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Katherine's response was equally firm, her heart full to bursting with the joy of this moment, this man, this second chance they had found together. After the ceremony, the celebration moved to the Horizon H, now to be known as the Double H, and a ranch where the house had been transformed for the occasion. Evergreen boughs and red ribbons decorated every surface, and tables groaned under the weight of food prepared by the women of the town. As evening fell, Quentin led Katherine outside to the porch, away from the noise and warmth of the gathering. Snow was falling again, soft flakes drifting down in the light from the windows. "Happy?" he asked, his arms around her waist. Katherine leaned back against his chest, contentment flowing through her. "Completely, and you, more than I ever thought possible." He kissed the top of her head. "When I think of how close I came to turning you away that first day—" "You tried," she reminded him with a laugh. "I was too stubborn to listen. Thank God for that." His arms tightened around her. "You saved me, Katherine, in every way a person can be saved." She turned in his embrace to face him. "We saved each other," she corrected. "And now we have the rest of our lives to build something beautiful together." Quentin lowered his head to kiss her, a promise sealed beneath the falling snow. Inside, their friends and neighbors celebrated. Around them, their land waited for spring and new growth. Before them stretched a future bright with possibility. And so, on that Christmas day in 1875, in the wild Montana territory, two hearts once wounded found their healing in each other, a testament to love's enduring power and the second chances that sometimes come when we least expect them but most need them.